Welcome back to another deep dive into the vast universe of Halo. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most controversial and fascinating aspects of the franchise, the Spartan programs. These super soldier initiatives reshaped humanity's war effort against the Covenant, but they came with costs that still spark debate among fans and within the universe itself. We're talking about kidnapped children, brutal augmentations, suicide missions, and the question that haunts every discussion of the Spartans. When does survival justify any cost? Before we descend into this morally complex territory, if you enjoy these explorations of science fiction's darker corners, hitting that subscribe button really helps the channel grow. It lets me know you want more content that doesn't shy away from the uncomfortable questions these stories ask us. Now, settle in. This is going to be a long journey through 3 generations of humanity's greatest warriors and the shadows they cast. The Spartans of Halo draw their name from ancient Greece, from the warriors of Sparta who trained from childhood in the agoge, a brutal educational system designed to produce soldiers of unmatched discipline and skill. At 7 years old, Spartan boys left their families to enter this communal training, learning to endure pain, hunger, and hardship. They emerged as warriors legendary for their courage at battles like Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off the Persian army long enough to save Greece. Dr. Catherine Halsey knew this history well when she chose the name Spartan for her program. It wasn't just about military prowess. It was about creating soldiers whose training began in childhood, who knew nothing but war, whose loyalty to each other exceeded even their loyalty to the state they served. The parallel was deliberate and, as we'll see, disturbingly accurate. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the Spartan programs, we need to understand the world that created them. In the 25th and 26th centuries, humanity had spread across hundreds of colony worlds. These outer colonies felt neglected and exploited by Earth's government, leading to the rise of the insurrection, a violent separatist movement. By the early 2500s, the United Nations Space Command faced a genuine crisis. Civil war loomed on the horizon, and conventional military responses only made things worse, turning civilian populations against Earth's authority. The Office of Naval Intelligence concluded that what they needed wasn't more conventional soldiers. They needed surgical instruments, small teams of elite operatives who could decapitate insurrectionist leadership without the collateral damage of full-scale military operations. They needed soldiers so effective that a handful could accomplish what entire battalions could not. They needed the impossible. They needed Spartans. The Spartan II program, Playing God. In 2517, Dr. Catherine Halsey stood before the leadership of the Office of Naval Intelligence with a proposal that would have gotten her arrested in any sane society. She wanted to kidnap children, replace them with flash clones programmed to die, subject these stolen children to years of brutal training, and then perform experimental augmentation procedures that would likely kill or cripple half of them. The survivors would become super soldiers, living weapons aimed at humanity's enemies. Oni approved the program immediately. Let's be clear about what happened here, because the sanitized language of military documents obscures the horror of it. 75 6-year-old children were identified through genetic screening, conducted under the guise of a vaccination program. Oni agents came for them in the night. The children were sedated and taken to the colony world Reach. In their beds, Oni left flash clones, genetic duplicates designed to mimic the children perfectly for a few weeks or months before dying of seemingly natural causes. Parents buried children who were still alive, stolen to become weapons they would never know existed. Among those children was John. Just John, because his last name no longer mattered. He would become Spartan 117, and eventually the Master Chief. But in 2517, he was just a 6-year-old boy who liked King of the Hill and wanted to make his parents proud. He never got the chance. None of them did. The selection criteria were exacting. Dr. Halsey didn't just want physically superior children. She screened for genetic markers associated with intelligence, aggression when necessary, the ability to work in teams, even predispositions toward leadership. She was selecting not just for current abilities, but for potential, looking for children whose genetics suggested they could become something more than human if given the right enhancement. The process was impersonal, clinical. Halsey would later write in her journal about the weight of these decisions, the knowledge that she was destroying families to build her army, but she convinced herself it was necessary. The projections were clear. Without intervention, the insurrection would escalate into full civil war within 20 years. Millions would die. The military's proposed solution was overwhelming force, basically glassing rebellious colonies. The Spartans, in Halsey's mind, were the lesser evil. A few dozen children sacrificed to save millions of lives. The children arrived at Reach between August and September 2517. They were given new designations, their first names combined with a 3-digit number. Family names were discarded. They weren't trying to erase these children's identities entirely. Halsey insisted they keep their first names, believing it would help maintain their humanity. But make no mistake, this was the beginning of their transformation from children into weapons. The training fell to Chief Petty Officer Franklin Mendez, a career soldier who understood what these children would face. Mendez was tough, sometimes brutal, but he genuinely cared about his charges. He pushed them to their absolute limits because he knew that in combat, those limits would be exceeded. Better to discover your breaking point in training than in battle, where the consequences were fatal. The training began immediately and was designed to break and rebuild these children from the ground up. Every morning started at 0530 hours. The children were shocked awake if they hesitated, literally hit with electric batons to teach them that orders were not negotiable. They showered, formed up outside, and began their physical training. 100 repetitions each of jumping jacks, sit-ups, deep squats, knee bends, and leg lifts for 6-year-olds before breakfast. After this morning routine, they jogged a mile to the Reach Naval Academy, where an AI named Deja taught them everything from mathematics and science to military history and tactics. Their first lesson was watching footage of the ancient Spartans at Thermopylae, understanding the legacy they were meant to inherit. Then more physical training, another 2-mile jog to what the instructors called the playground. The playground was a nightmare. Imagine a massive obstacle course suspended in midair, a maze of platforms and obstacles with a bell at the top. The children were divided into teams of 3 and told to ring the bell and cross the finish line. Simple enough, except the course was designed to be impossible for one person alone. Success required teamwork, communication, coordination. The children who tried to go it alone failed. The children who learned to work together, to leverage each other's strengths and cover each other's weaknesses, those children succeeded. This was the core philosophy of the Spartan II training. It wasn't just about creating individually superior soldiers. Mendes and Halsey wanted to forge teams that functioned as a single organism, where every member instinctively knew what the others would do, where trust was absolute. They succeeded. The bonds formed during this training would prove stronger than family, stronger than the memories these children retained of lives they'd lost. John 117 emerged as a natural leader during these early years. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest, though he was certainly among the top performers. What set John apart was his ability to think tactically under pressure and his genuine concern for his team. He made decisions that prioritized the group's success over individual glory. Other emerging leaders included Kurt 051, who possessed an almost preternatural intuition about danger, Jerome 092, whose tactical mind complemented physical prowess, and Frederick 104, steady and reliable under any circumstances. The training evolved as the children grew. What started as team-building exercises escalated to full combat simulations. Mendes taught them to string tripwires, fire rifles, treat wounds in the field. The exercises often included twists, hidden stun mines on obstacle courses, snipers with paintball rounds during parade drills, scenarios designed to teach that the enemy wouldn't fight fair, so neither could they. 2 years into the program, Mendes took them to the Military Wilderness Training Preserve for what he called a training exercise. He divided them into teams, gave each a fragment of a map, and told them they had to piece it together and find their way to an extraction point. Then he left them in the forest, with no supplies and winter coming. They had to survive for days, working together, navigating terrain, evading instructors acting as enemy forces. Children who failed to work with their teams faced consequences that drove home the lesson. Cooperation meant survival. Isolation meant death. The training locations varied to ensure the Spartans could operate in any environment. They trained in the highland mountains surrounding the Fleetcom compound on Reach, learning wilderness survival and high-altitude operations. They went to Emerald Cove for aquatic operations. They trained at the Chiron facility over Mars, learning to fight in extreme conditions and zero gravity. Every environment presented new challenges, new lessons in adaptation. By their early teens, the Spartans were conducting training exercises against fully trained UNSC units and winning consistently. This created tension. Regular soldiers resented being beaten by children. even children who had been training for combat since age 6. The situation came to a head with Tango Company, a unit assigned to run training exercises against the Spartans. After repeated defeats, some members of Tango Company began playing rough during exercises, causing accidents when they captured Spartans. It escalated until Tango Company's commanding officer, furious at his unit's inability to stop 12-year-olds, ordered them to use live ammunition instead of stun rounds. The augmented Spartans, by then 14 years old, were transferred to an abandoned titanium mine to reduce injury risk to other personnel. Their trainers were forced to wear powered armor just to keep up with them. Training missions invariably ended in Spartan victories, with even security cameras neutralized. Through all of this, Mendez drilled discipline, honor, and respect into his charges. He taught them to kill, yes, but also the difference between right and wrong. These weren't mindless killers being created. They were soldiers with a code, warriors who understood the weight of taking a life. Mendez succeeded perhaps too well. The Spartans developed a loyalty to each other that exceeded their loyalty to the UNSC itself. They would follow orders, but if an order threatened one of their own, those orders became negotiable. Creating gods or monsters. In March 2525, the 75 Spartan II candidates, now 14 years old, underwent the procedures that would transform them from merely exceptional humans into something beyond human. Comprehension. The augmentation protocols were conducted in an Oni medical facility in orbit over Reach, a sterile environment where the futures of these children would be decided by surgical precision and luck. The procedures were extensive and had never been tested on human subjects. Halsey and her team had conducted simulations, tested components on primates, but they were essentially experimenting on these children. Admiral Yzionris Jerome, Halsey's mentor, reviewed the planned augmentations under the pretense that they would be performed on chimpanzees. His assessment was grim. High risk of severe complications and death. He hoped, he wrote, that Halsey's proposal was merely hypothetical. It wasn't. The augmentations included carbide ceramic ossification, which grafted advanced material onto the candidate's skeletal structure to make their bones virtually unbreakable. This procedure felt, according to those who survived, like their bones were being shattered from the inside, as if their marrow was glass breaking. The candidates were unconscious, but their brains still processed the signals, creating phantom pain of excruciating intensity. Muscular enhancement injections increased muscle density and decreased lactate recovery time, allowing the Spartans to fight harder for longer without the lactic acid buildup that causes muscle fatigue in normal humans. Catalytic thyroid implants boosted growth hormones, resulting in the Spartans achieving heights exceeding 2 meters and weights over 200 pounds. Their bodies were literally growing into living weapons. The neural modifications were perhaps most crucial and most dangerous. Superconducting fabrication of neural dendrites increased synaptic firing speed, giving the Spartans reaction times that bordered on precognitive. They could see a threat and respond before a normal human's brain had even processed the danger. Retinal capillary inversion improved vision to near-perfect levels. Every sense was heightened. Every physical system enhanced beyond natural human limits. The results were catastrophic in their own way. Out of 75 candidates, 30 died during or immediately after the procedures. Their bodies rejected the augmentations, leading to cardiac arrest, neurological failure, or complications so severe that survival was impossible. 12 more were so severely injured that they were crippled, paralyzed, or maimed for life. These washouts, as they were clinically termed, were not buried or cremated. Halsey had their bodies placed in cryogenic storage, hoping that future medical advances might revive them. Some were secretly rehabilitated and pressed into ONI service, their survival kept secret, even from their fellow Spartans. That left 33. 33 children who survived with no major complications, who woke from the procedures with bodies that exceeded human limitations. They were stronger, faster, had better reflexes and senses than any soldier in UNSC history. They could lift 3 times their body weight, run at speeds exceeding 34 miles per hour, punch with the force of a hydraulic press. Their bones were dense enough to survive falls that would shatter normal human skeletons. Within months of the augmentation procedures, they were demonstrating capabilities that seemed impossible. Kelly 087 proved to be the fastest, capable of running even faster than the already superhuman speeds her fellow Spartans achieved. John 117 demonstrated a combination of strength, speed, and tactical brilliance that made him stand out even among this exceptional group. In one incident, Will 043 engaged a pair of hunters, towering alien warriors in powered armor, in hand-to-hand combat, and killed one by literally tearing the colony of worms that composed its body from its armor. But the augmentations came with side effects beyond the immediate failure rate. The survivors experienced neurological confusion as their brains relearned how to control bodies that moved faster and hit harder than before. They dropped things, misjudged distances, experienced intense headaches and occasional bleeding from the eyes. These symptoms diminished over time, but they never entirely disappeared. The Spartans would forever process the world differently than normal humans, operating on a level that made interactions with non-augmented personnel challenging. There's also the psychological weight to consider. Imagine being 14 years old and learning that 42 of your brothers and sisters died so you could become a weapon. The survivors carried that guilt, that knowledge that their existence came at such a terrible price. Some, like John 117, channeled it into determination to make the sacrifices worth it. Others, like Kurt 051, were haunted by survivors' guilt that would shape their entire lives. The timing of the augmentations was critical. The procedures required subjects at the onset of puberty, when their bodies were still growing and malleable enough to accept the modifications without the catastrophic failure rates that adult augmentation produced. This was a lesson learned from the earlier Orion project, where augmentation of adult volunteers had shown promise, but ultimately proved too limited and unreliable. The Spartan IIs would not repeat those mistakes, even if it meant experimenting on children. Halsey wrestled with the ethics, at least privately. Her journal entries from this period show a woman who understood the magnitude of what she was doing. She had doubts. She wondered if they should delay, conduct more research, refine the procedures. But Oni pushed for deployment. Something had happened. Something that changed everything. On February 3rd, 2525, the agricultural colony of Harvest sent a distress signal. Then silence. When the UNSC arrived to investigate, they found the planet glassed. Its surface turned to molten slag. 3 billion people dead. Humanity had made contact with an alien civilization called the Covenant, and that civilization wanted humanity extinct. Suddenly, the Spartans weren't being prepared to fight insurrectionists. They were humanity's best hope against an enemy with superior technology, numbers, and a religious mandate to annihilate every human in the galaxy. The ethical questions didn't go away, but they became more complicated. If the Spartans could make the difference between humanity's survival and extinction, did the ends justify the means? The Spartan IIs were outfitted with Mjolnir-powered assault armor, battlesuit that interfaced directly with their augmented nervous systems. Normal humans couldn't wear Mjolnir. The armor's response time would break their bones and tear their muscles. But the Spartans' augmented bodies could handle it, and with the armor, they became truly superhuman. A Spartan in Mjolnir could flip a Warthog vehicle, survive direct hits from weapons that would vaporize an unarmored human, and engage multiple enemies simultaneously with precision that seemed choreographed. They were deployed against the Covenant immediately, and they were devastatingly effective. Missions that would have required entire companies of Marines were accomplished by 4-person Spartan fire teams. They boarded Covenant vessels, destroyed strategic targets, rescued hostages from impossible situations. They became legends, whispered about by both UNSC personnel and Covenant forces. The aliens called them demons, a term of respect and fear. But legends came at a cost. The Spartans were deployed to the most dangerous missions, sent where regular forces couldn't go. They took casualties. Samuel 034 died in 2525, the first Spartan killed in action, sacrificing himself to destroy a Covenant vessel. More would follow. Kurt 051 went missing in 2531 during a mission to investigate a damaged slipspace engine. His fate would remain unknown to his fellow Spartans for over 20 years. Others fell in battles across human space. To maintain morale, Oni instituted a policy that all deceased Spartans would be listed as missing in action or wounded in action, never killed in action. The official reasoning was practical. Spartans wore armor that included transponders, so if a body couldn't be recovered, the Spartan might have been captured or escaped. The real reason was psychological warfare against both the Covenant and humanity's own fears. Spartans never die. they're just missing in action. The legend must never falter. By 2552, at the height of the war, fewer than 30 Spartan IIs remained in active service. They had saved countless lives, turned the tide of numerous battles, prevented humanity's extinction multiple times over. But they were mortal, despite the legend. They bled. They fell. The question that haunted Dr. Halsey was simple. Had it been worth it? 75 children stolen, 30 dead, 12 crippled, and the survivors turned into weapons who knew nothing but war. Had humanity's survival justified this? Covenant would ultimately provide the answer, though not in the way anyone expected. The Spartan III program: cheaper, faster, more expendable. Colonel James Ackerson looked at the Spartan II program and saw its fundamental flaw. Not the ethics, though Ackerson had his own complicated relationship with Dr. Halsey's methods. No, the flaw was scalability. The Spartan IIs were incredibly effective, but there were too few of them. Training took 8 years. The augmentation procedures killed 40% of candidates and crippled another 16%. The cost per Spartan was astronomical. By the time a Spartan II was combat-ready, the UNSC might have already lost the war. Ackerson proposed a solution that was both brilliant and horrifying. The Spartan III program. Make the augmentations cheaper and safer, even if that meant the resulting soldiers were slightly less effective than the IIs. Reduce training time, increase numbers dramatically, and, most controversially, design the program around a simple truth. These Spartans would be expendable. The Spartan III candidates would not be kidnapped from happy homes. They would be war orphans, children who had lost everything to Covenant attacks. Psychologically, this solved multiple problems. There was no need for kidnapping or flash clones. These children had no families to miss them. They were already motivated by revenge, by rage at what the Covenant had taken from them. That motivation could be channeled, refined, turned into a weapon as sharp as any blade. In 2531, Oni conducted a covert operation to recruit the first Spartan III class. They needed a trainer, someone who understood what the Spartans were and how to create them. They needed a Spartan II. Kurt 051's disappearance during a mission to Station Delphi wasn't an accident. His thruster pack didn't malfunction. Oni staged the entire event to remove Kurt from active duty without raising suspicion among his fellow Spartans. Kurt woke up a month later to find Colonel Ackerson explaining his new assignment. Kurt would train the next generation of Spartans, given a new surname, Ambrose, to hide his identity. He was promoted to Lieutenant Junior grade, later rising to Lieutenant Commander as the program proved successful. For Kurt, this was both honor and burden. He would have the opportunity to create soldiers who might prevent others from suffering the losses he'd witnessed. But he would also be condemning children to lives of combat and, likely, early deaths. The Spartan III program was based on the planet Onyx, a classified Oni facility far from prying eyes. The training was conducted at Camp Currahee, named after the mountain where American paratroopers trained during World War II. Kurt was joined by Senior Chief Petty Officer Franklin Mendez, the man who had trained the Spartan IIs. Together, they would shape 3 companies of Spartan IIIs, each with hundreds of candidates. Alpha Company began training on December 27, 2532. Of the 497 children conscripted, 300 made it through training and augmentations to become Spartans. The procedures were refined from the Spartan II protocols, still requiring candidates at the onset of puberty, but with significantly reduced risk. The augmentations were less invasive, relying more on chemical enhancement than surgical modification. The result was a soldier who was less capable than a Spartan II, but far more reliable to produce. The key difference was psychological. Spartan IIs were conditioned to believe in the mission, in the UNSC, in protecting humanity. Spartan IIIs were fueled by revenge. They weren't fighting for abstract concepts of duty and honor. They were fighting to make the Covenant pay for what they'd done. This made them incredibly aggressive in combat, but also potentially unstable. Kurt and Mendez worked to channel that rage, to teach these children that while vengeance might motivate them, professionalism would keep them alive. Alpha Company was activated in November 2536. They were equipped not with Mjolnir armor, but with semi-powered infiltration armor, cheaper and less capable, but adequate for their intended role. And what was that role? Suicide missions. The Spartan IIIs were designed for operations where success mattered more than survival, where sacrificing an entire company to achieve a strategic objective was acceptable. Alpha Company's record was exemplary at first. They fought at Mamore, New Constantinople, and the Bonanza asteroid belt, destroying Covenant forces and insurrectionist strongholds. They were effective, lethal, everything Ackerson had promised. 9 months after activation, they were deployed on Operation Prometheus, a mission to destroy a Covenant orbital shipyard. All 300 Spartans were killed. The mission was successful. The shipyard was destroyed, dealing a significant blow to Covenant operations in that sector. But an entire company of Spartans, children ranging from 14 to 17 years old, died to accomplish it. Kurt was devastated. He had trained these children, watched them grow, believed he was preparing them to survive. Instead, he had prepared them to die. Ackerson's response was to approve Beta Company immediately. 418 candidates were conscripted in 2539, with 300 graduating to active service. Kurt, shaken by Alpha Company's fate, improved the training regimen. He emphasized unit cohesion even more than before, drilling the Spartans on working together, covering each other, maximizing survival through teamwork. Beta Company received upgraded SPI armor and additional training in infiltration and stealth. In July 2545, Beta Company was deployed on Operation Torpedo, a mission to destroy a Covenant refinery. Like Prometheus before it, Torpedo was successful. Unlike Prometheus, there were survivors. 2. Tom B-292 and Lucy B-091 made it out alive, out of 300 deployed. Lucy was so traumatized by watching her entire company die around her that she stopped speaking entirely. Tom and Lucy would eventually become assistant trainers for Gamma Company. but the psychological scars of torpedo never fully healed. Gamma Company began training with an important difference. Kurt, determined to reduce casualties, instituted illegal modifications to the augmentation procedures. He added drugs that altered the Spartans' brain chemistry, making them resistant to pain and shock. In combat, Gamma Company Spartans could ignore wounds that would incapacitate normal humans, fighting on with injuries that should have been fatal. The downside was addiction and the risk of going berserk if the drug's effects took hold at the wrong time. 330 candidates underwent training for Gamma Company, and for the first time, all 330 graduated successfully. Every single candidate survived the augmentations without complications. Kurt considered Gamma Company the finest Spartans ever produced, combining the lessons learned from Alpha and Beta companies with improved augmentation protocols. But Gamma Company would never deploy as a complete unit. Most were scattered to various combat zones in the war's final years. 15 remained on Onyx to compete for top honors when the planet came under attack in October 2552. These 15 Spartans, along with Kurt, Mendez, and a handful of Spartan IIs, would be caught in the Battle of Onyx, fighting both Covenant forces and ancient Forerunner constructs. The Spartan III program also produced something unexpected: Category 2 Spartans. Some candidates were so exceptional that Kurt and Mendez pulled them from their companies before the inevitable suicide missions. These Cat 2 Spartans were reassigned to special operations units and equipped with Mjolnir armor, making them nearly as capable as Spartan IIs. Noble Team, the unit featured in Halo Reach, was composed primarily of Cat 2 Spartans. Noble Team's roster during the fall of Reach included Carter A259 from Alpha Company, commanding the team with the rank of Commander; Catherine B320, a genius-level intelligence specialist from Beta Company; Emil A239, Alpha Company's close-quarters combat expert; June A266, Alpha Company's sniper; Jorge 052, the team's only Spartan II, serving as a link between the programs; and Spartan B312, known as Noble 6, a Cat 2 from Beta Company with a heavily redacted service record. Noble Team's fate during the fall of Reach exemplifies both the effectiveness and the tragedy of the Spartan III program. Jorge sacrificed himself believing he had saved Reach, not knowing the battle was just beginning. Catherine was killed by a Covenant sniper. Carter deliberately crashed his Pelican into a Scarab to clear a path for the rest of the team. Emil died in close combat, taking multiple enemies with him. Noble 6 remained behind to ensure the Pillar of Autumn could escape, making a last stand against overwhelming odds. Only June survived, escaping Reach with Dr. Halsey. The irony is crushing. The Spartan IIIs were designed to be expendable, yet their effectiveness made them invaluable. The Cat 2 program was supposed to save the best from suicide missions, yet even they faced overwhelming casualty rates. By the war's end, only a handful of Spartan IIIs remained alive out of over 900 trained. The program had achieved its goal of producing large numbers of effective soldiers, but the cost was measured in children's lives expended like ammunition. Kurt 051's final act exemplifies the Spartan III philosophy. During the Battle of Onyx, with Covenant forces threatening to follow the survivors into a Forerunner shield world, Kurt remained behind to hold the entrance. He fought until he was mortally wounded, then detonated 2 Fenris nuclear warheads, vaporizing himself and the pursuing Covenant forces. His last words, transmitted to the Covenant Fleet Master, were, "Didn't you know? Spartans never die." The Spartan III program was discontinued after the war ended in 2553. The Onyx facility was gone, destroyed in the battle. Kurt was dead. The surviving Spartans were folded into the newly created Spartan Operations Branch, where they would serve alongside Spartans from other programs. The legacy of the Threes wasn't just in their combat effectiveness, but in the philosophical question they represented. How many lives is victory worth? The Spartan IV program, redemption or compromise? When the Human Covenant War ended in March 2553, the UNSC faced an interesting problem. The Spartan programs had proven essential to humanity's survival, but the methods used to create Spartan IIs and IIIs were morally indefensible in peacetime. You can't kidnap children or recruit traumatized war orphans when there's no existential threat justifying the atrocity. Yet the galaxy remained dangerous. Covenant remnants, insurrectionists, rogue AI, Forerunner technology activating unpredictably, all presented ongoing threats that required Spartans to address. The solution was the Spartan IV program, conceived by Rear Admiral Musa Ghanem, service number 096. Musa's story is particularly significant because he was a Spartan II washout, one of the 12 candidates crippled by the augmentation procedures. He spent decades in a wheelchair, his body destroyed by Halsey's experiment, but his mind sharp, and his understanding of what Spartans could accomplish undiminished. Despite his resentment toward Halsey, Musa recognized that Spartans were necessary. He just believed there had to be a better way to create them. The Spartan IV program would use adult volunteers exclusively. No kidnapping, no traumatized children. Recruits would come from the best combat veterans across all branches of the UNSC military: Marines, ODSTs, Navy personnel, anyone who had proven themselves in combat and wanted to become something more. This solved the ethical problems of previous programs, while tapping into a much larger potential recruitment pool. Where the Spartan IIs had 75 candidates and the Spartan IIIs had roughly 900 across 3 companies, the Spartan IV program could theoretically recruit thousands. The augmentation procedures were completely redesigned. Advances in medical technology made augmenting adults significantly safer than it had been during the Orion project 50 years earlier. The procedures were still extensive and painful, but the mortality rate was essentially 0. Project Orchid, as the augmentation program was codenamed, took 3 weeks to complete, with candidates moving in and out of surgeries and advanced therapies throughout. The augmentations differed methodologically from previous programs while achieving similar ends. Where Spartan IIs had carbide ceramic grafted to their bones, Spartan IVs received skeletal fullerene lattice implants, achieving nearly the same strength increase through different means. Vision enhancement came from ocular implants rather than retinal modification. Muscular enhancement used more advanced gene therapies. Every system was optimized for adult subjects, accepting that adult augmentation would never match what could be achieved by augmenting subjects at puberty, but making it safe enough for mass deployment. The result was a Spartan IV who was less physically capable than a Spartan II or III out of armor, but could match them when equipped with second-generation Mjolnir armor. The Gen 2 Mjolnir platform was designed specifically to compensate for the IV's less extensive augmentations, featuring improved strength multipliers, more advanced shields, and integrated technology that made the armor itself smarter and more responsive. Jonny 266, the lone survivor of Noble Team, played a crucial role in establishing the Spartan IV program. His experience as both a Spartan III and a soldier who had witnessed the best and worst of the Spartan programs made him ideal for recruitment and training. June understood what made someone a good Spartan candidate, and it wasn't just physical ability or combat experience. He looked for people who could work in teams, who could handle the psychological weight of being living legends, who understood that being a Spartan meant being held to a higher standard in everything they did. The first Spartan IV candidates were carefully selected from among the war's heroes. Spartan Sarah Palmer, who would become the first Spartan operations commander, was an ODST who had distinguished herself repeatedly against the Covenant. Edward Buck, another ODST with a stellar record, eventually joined the program. These were soldiers who had already proven themselves in the crucible of war, who had survived situations that killed most of their comrades, who had demonstrated not just skill, but character. Training for Spartan IVs was intensive, but fundamentally different from previous programs. Where Spartan IIs trained for 8 years starting at age 6, and Spartan IIIs trained for roughly 4 years starting around age 6 to 8, Spartan IVs underwent a relatively compressed training program after their augmentations. They already had military experience, combat skills, tactical knowledge. What they needed was acclimation to their enhanced bodies and integration into Spartan culture. The cultural aspect was perhaps more challenging than anyone anticipated. The Spartan IIs and surviving IIIs had spent their entire conscious lives as Spartans. It defined them completely. They had no other identity, no life outside the program. Spartan IVs, in contrast, had been Marines or ODSTs or Navy personnel first. They had families, friends, lives before becoming Spartans. This created tension between the generations. Some Spartan IIs viewed the IVs as inferior, soldiers playing dress-up in armor they hadn't earned through childhood sacrifice. The fact that IVs were physically less capable outside of armor reinforced this prejudice. More than once, Spartan IIs engaged IVs in training exercises without armor, decisively demonstrating the gap in raw augmentation. The message was clear. You might wear the armor, but you're not one of us. The Spartan IVs, for their part, sometimes resented what they saw as elitism from the IIs. Yes, the IIs had been through hell, but they also had never been anything else. They didn't understand what it meant to be a regular soldier, to have fought and survived without superhuman enhancements. The IVs had earned their places through their own actions, not because they'd been genetically selected and kidnapped as children. Both perspectives had merit, and the tension between them would persist for years. Spartan Operations was established as its own branch within the UNSC, headquartered aboard the UNSC Infinity, a massive Forerunner-enhanced warship that served as humanity's flagship in the post-war era. The Infinity carried hundreds of Spartans, support personnel, researchers, and enough firepower to crack planets. It was simultaneously a symbol of humanity's resurgence and a mobile Spartan training and deployment platform. The Spartan IV program's first major test came during the Requiem campaign in 2557 and 2558. The Infinity encountered Forerunner forces and Covenant remnants on the shield world Requiem, engaging in months of combat operations. Spartan Operations deployed teams repeatedly, suffering casualties, but proving that the Fours could handle combat situations comparable to what previous generations had faced. The loss of Spartans Gabriel Thorne's fire team, ambushed and captured by Covenant forces, demonstrated that Fours were mortal, just like their predecessors. But their overall performance validated the program's viability. By 2558, the Spartan IV program had recruited approximately 500 Spartans, with more in the augmentation pipeline. This represented more active Spartans than had existed at any point during the war, spread across multiple ships and installations rather than concentrated in a few dozen operators. The strategic flexibility this provided was enormous. The UNSC could deploy Spartan fire teams to multiple simultaneous operations, something impossible when there were only 30 Spartan IIs. However, questions persisted about whether quantity could truly replace quality. A 4-person Spartan II fire team had repeatedly accomplished missions that conventional wisdom said required an entire company. Could Spartan IVs match that effectiveness? The answer appeared to be sometimes, depending on circumstances. Against opponents that previous generations had faced, like Covenant forces, Spartan IVs performed admirably. Against threats specifically designed to kill Spartans, like the Promethean forces encountered on Requiem, 4s took higher casualties than 2s likely would have. The psychological profile of Spartan 4s also differed significantly from their predecessors. Spartan 2s had been conditioned from childhood to follow orders without question, to view the mission as paramount, to sacrifice themselves without hesitation if required. Spartan 4s, having lived adult lives before augmentation, retained more independence. They questioned orders they disagreed with, advocated for alternatives, sometimes prioritized their own survival over mission parameters. This wasn't cowardice. It was normal human behavior that the 2s had been trained out of. Commander Sarah Palmer exemplified both the strengths and challenges of Spartan 4 psychology. She was aggressive, confident, unwilling to back down from anyone regardless of rank. When she disagreed with decisions, she made her objections known, sometimes insubordinately. This made her an effective combat leader, but a challenging subordinate. The contrast with Spartan IIs like the Master Chief, who executed orders with minimal comment regardless of personal feelings, was stark. The Spartan IV program also had to grapple with the legacy of Dr. Halsey and the Spartan II program. In 2553, Halsey was arrested and charged with numerous crimes related to the Spartan II program, including kidnapping, unethical experimentation, and other violations of military law and basic human rights. Her trial became a public spectacle, with the details of what had been done to create the Spartan IIs finally emerging into public knowledge. The revelation that the Master Chief and the other Spartan IIs were kidnapped children subjected to potentially lethal experiments shocked civilian populations. The UNSC had to navigate public relations nightmare while simultaneously defending the necessity of the Spartan programs. The argument boiled down to, yes, terrible things were done, but those terrible things saved humanity from extinction. The Spartan IIs had prevented the annihilation of the human species. Did that justify the crimes committed to create them? Public opinion divided sharply. Some viewed Halsey as a war criminal who deserved execution for what she'd done to children. Others saw her as a visionary who made impossible choices to save billions of lives. The Spartan IIs themselves largely defended Halsey, not because they forgave what she'd done, but because she was the closest thing to a mother figure any of them had. This complicated the prosecution's case considerably. How do you condemn someone for child abuse when the victims defend them? The Spartan IV program positioned itself as the ethical Spartan program, the one that didn't require moral compromises. Adult volunteers, safe augmentations, no kidnapping, no child soldiers. It was the program that proved you could have Spartans without atrocity. This marketing, while accurate, sometimes rang hollow to those who understood what Spartan IIs and IIIs had endured. The IVs were possible because the IIs and IIIs had first proven that Spartans could work, had justified the expense and research through their accomplishments. The Spartan IV program's ethical foundation was built on earlier programs' unethical actions. Integration between the programs improved over time. Spartan IIs who survived the war, including the Master Chief, Blue Team, and others, worked alongside IVs during various operations. Surviving Spartan IIIs similarly integrated into Spartan operations. Gradually, a Spartan culture emerged that transcended program origins. You might have started as a 2, 3, or 4, but you were all Spartans now, bound by common purpose and shared experiences, even if those experiences differed dramatically. The training facilities for Spartan IVs emphasized this unity. Veterans from previous programs served as instructors, teaching not just combat skills, but Spartan philosophy and history. New recruits learned about the sacrifices made by earlier generations, about the weight of wearing Mjolnir armor, about what it meant to be a Spartan. The goal was to create soldiers who were technically proficient, but also understood the legacy they were joining. By the late 2550s, the Spartan IV program had evolved into a mature military branch with its own culture, traditions, and institutional knowledge. The early tensions between IVs and earlier generations had diminished, if not disappeared entirely. Spartans worked together, regardless of program origin, focusing on the mission rather than the circumstances of their creation. The ethical questions hadn't gone away, but they were no longer the defining feature of the Spartan experience. One significant development was the declassification of Spartan IV identities. Where Spartan IIs and IIIs operated in secrecy, their faces hidden, their names classified, Spartan IVs were public figures. They gave interviews, appeared in propaganda, had public service records. This served multiple purposes. It humanized Spartans to civilian populations. It made recruitment easier when potential candidates could see and interact with Spartans. And it reinforced that IVs were different from the child soldier programs that preceded them. However, this publicity came with costs. Spartan IVs became targets for assassination attempts, kidnapping plots, and propaganda campaigns by enemy forces. Their families, who unlike previous generations' families knew their children or spouses had become Spartans, became potential leverage points. Some Spartans struggled with sudden fame, uncomfortable with being recognized and celebrated when they just wanted to do their jobs. The Spartan II's anonymity had protected them from these issues, even as it dehumanized them. The question of whether the Spartan IV program could sustain itself long-term remained open. The program required a steady stream of qualified volunteers, extensive medical facilities for augmentations, enormous quantities of expensive equipment, and the political will to maintain funding for what was essentially an elite special operations force. In peacetime, all of these became potentially vulnerable to budget cuts or political opposition. More philosophically, the Spartan IV program represented humanity's attempt to have Spartans without moral compromise, to gain the benefits of supersoldiers without the ethical costs. Whether this was truly possible, or simply a more palatable form of the same basic problem, turning human beings into weapons, remained a question without clear answer. The IVs were volunteers, yes, but they volunteered for a program that fundamentally changed what they were, that made them dependent on technology and medical support for the rest of their lives, that marked them as different from the rest of humanity, forever. June A. 266, who had survived the Spartan III program and helped build the Spartan IV program, understood this tension better than most. He knew what it meant to be a child soldier, to be created as an expendable weapon. He also understood what the IVs didn't, that being a Spartan wasn't just about enhanced abilities and fancy armor. It was about sacrifice, about being willing to do what others couldn't or wouldn't, about carrying the weight of legends built on dead children's graves. The IVs had volunteered for enhanced combat abilities. Whether they understood what they'd actually signed up for would only become clear with time. Ethics under fire. The moral philosophy of creating supersoldiers. The Spartan programs force us to confront uncomfortable questions about ends and means, about what is justifiable in the face of existential threats, about the value we place on individual rights versus collective survival. These aren't abstract philosophical exercises. They're questions about real choices made by real people in desperate circumstances. Choices with consequences that rippled across centuries. Start with the fundamental ethical problem of the Spartan II program, the kidnapping. 75 children were taken from their families without consent, replaced with clones designed to die, raised as weapons from age 6. This is unambiguously wrong by any conventional moral framework. Kidnapping is a crime. Experimenting on children without consent violates medical ethics. The use of flash clones to cover up the kidnappings compounds the deception. There's no way to frame this as ethically neutral, let alone good. Dr. Halsey's defense, when forced to articulate one, was consequentialist. She argued that the harm done to 75 children was justified by the good achieved, preventing a civil war that would have killed millions, and later, providing the soldiers necessary to survive the Covenant War. Without the Spartan IIs, humanity would have been exterminated. Therefore, the kidnapping and augmentation of these children, while regrettable, was necessary and ultimately moral. This argument has a certain logic if you accept its premises. The insurrection was genuinely spiraling toward full civil war. The military's proposed solution was increasingly draconian measures against colonial populations, which would have escalated violence and potentially fractured human civilization. The Spartan IIs provided a surgical alternative, small teams that could neutralize insurrectionist leadership without mass civilian casualties. If the choice was between kidnapping 75 children and allowing a war that killed millions, choosing the kidnapping could be considered the lesser evil. The Covenant War strengthened this argument exponentially. The Covenant was an existential threat in the most literal sense. They wanted humanity extinct, and they had the technology and numbers to accomplish it. Conventional military forces were losing badly, with colony after colony glassed, billions dead. The Spartan IIs repeatedly turned the tide of critical battles, prevented catastrophic defeats, bought time for humanity to develop countermeasures. Without them, humanity probably would have been annihilated by 2535, 20 years before the war actually ended. But consequentialist ethics have problems. The most obvious is that Halsey couldn't have known in 2517 that the Covenant War would occur. She created the Spartan IIs to fight insurrectionists, not aliens. The justification she used later, that the Spartans saved humanity from extinction, was retrospective rationalization. She got lucky that her child soldiers happened to be perfect for fighting the enemy she couldn't have predicted. Does that luck make the initial decision ethical? Moreover, consequentialism requires certainty about outcomes that we rarely have. Halsey believed the Spartan IIs would prevent civil war. But could she be certain? What if the program had failed? What if all 75 children had died during augmentation? Would the kidnappings still have been justified by the intended good, even if no good resulted? At what point does the uncertainty of outcomes undermine consequentialist justification? There's also the question of alternatives. Did Halsey explore every possible option before resorting to kidnapping children? The Orion Project had experimented with adult augmentation and found it less effective, but still useful. Could improved adult augmentation have provided 80% of the capability at 20% of the ethical cost? We don't know, because Halsey was convinced that childhood augmentation was necessary and didn't seriously pursue alternatives. The counter-argument is that Halsey did what military leaders and governments do constantly: made difficult choices with incomplete information under time pressure. She saw a problem, the insurrection spiraling out of control, and designed a solution that might work. Oni approved it, providing institutional support and oversight. The Spartan II program wasn't a rogue scientist's mad experiment. It was an officially sanctioned military program with clear objectives and chains of command. If it was immoral, the immorality was systemic, not individual. This raises questions about institutional culpability. Oni approved the kidnappings. FleetCom provided facilities and resources. Mendez trained the children knowing where they came from. Hundreds of people participated in the Spartan II program, most of whom presumably considered themselves moral people doing necessary work. Were they all complicit in child abuse? Or were they soldiers following orders in a military hierarchy that distributed responsibility in ways that made individual culpability ambiguous? The Spartan III program presents different ethical problems. The candidates weren't kidnapped. They were war orphans recruited into a military program, which seems more defensible. But consider what actually happened. Oni agents went to refugee camps and identified traumatized children who had just lost everything. They told these children they could get revenge on the Covenant, offered them purpose and power and the chance to strike back. Then they trained these children for years, specifically to die on suicide missions. Is this better than kidnapping? The children technically chose to join, but calling it choice seems generous. These were traumatized, grieving children offered a chance at vengeance by authority figures in a military context where refusing wasn't really an option. The choice was between remaining a powerless refugee or becoming a powerful soldier. That's not informed consent in any meaningful sense. The suicide mission aspect is particularly troubling. Alpha Company's Operation Prometheus was designed from the start as a one-way trip. 300 Spartans were deployed knowing they probably wouldn't return. And indeed, none did. Beta Company's Operation Torpedo had 2 survivors out of 300. These weren't missions where casualties were expected. They were missions where survival was nearly impossible. The Spartans were ammunition, expended to achieve strategic objectives. Colonel Ackerson's justification was pragmatic. The war required sacrifices, and suicide missions using 300 expendable soldiers were preferable to losing thousands in conventional assaults. The strategic targets destroyed by Prometheus and Torpedo couldn't have been eliminated without massive casualties. Using Spartans specifically trained and equipped for these missions minimized total deaths. Cold calculus, but defensible in a war of extermination. Except these weren't adult soldiers making informed decisions to undertake suicidal missions. These were teenagers, 14 to 17 years old, sent to die. They had been conditioned from childhood to accept this fate, trained to channel their trauma into weapons against the enemy. Can someone in that psychological state truly consent to suicide missions? Or are they victims of manipulation, however well-intentioned? Kurt 051's perspective is illuminating here. He trained Alpha Company, watched them deploy on Prometheus, and learned of their complete annihilation. His reaction was devastation, guilt, horror at what he'd been complicit in. He tried to improve training for Beta Company, to give them better survival chances. but torpedoes still resulted in over 99% casualties. By Gamma Company, Kurt was actively sabotaging the program's design, adding illegal augmentations to improve survivability, even if it risked his career. Kurt's actions suggest he recognized the moral weight of what he was doing. He couldn't refuse. The war required the Spartan III program, and if he didn't train these children, someone else would. Possibly someone less invested in their survival. But he tried within his constraints to make the program less murderous. His final act, sacrificing himself at Onyx to save others, was perhaps atonement for the hundreds of children he'd trained for death. The Spartan IV program sidesteps many of these ethical issues by using adult volunteers. Adults can provide informed consent. They understand the risks, the permanence of augmentation, the life they're committing to. There's no kidnapping, no manipulation of traumatized children, no suicide missions for teenagers. The 4Vs chose their path with full knowledge. But does this fully resolve the ethical questions? The 4Vs are still being transformed into weapons, still having their bodies and minds permanently altered. They're dependent on technology and support systems for the rest of their lives. They can never return to being normal humans. The augmentations are irreversible. Have they consented to becoming something other than human? Can someone truly consent to that transformation? Or are there limits to what you should be allowed to do to yourself, even voluntarily? There's also the question of what constitutes real choice. The Spartan IV recruits were elite soldiers, people who had already spent years in combat, who had seen friends die, who were shaped by military culture and hierarchy. When June A266 approaches you and says you could become a Spartan, save more lives, become a legend, are you really free to refuse? The social pressure, the opportunity for advancement, the appeal to your sense of duty, all create a context where consent is complicated even for adults. Additionally, the Spartan IV program exists because earlier programs proved Spartans were necessary. The ethical foundation of using adult volunteers rests on the unethical foundation of child soldiers who demonstrated the concept's viability. The 4Vs benefit from research conducted on kidnapped children and war orphans. Can a program be ethical if it's built on previous atrocities, even if its own practices are defensible? These questions become more acute when we consider the broader implications. The Spartan programs normalized the idea that creating supersoldiers was acceptable, even necessary. If humanity faces another existential threat, will future leaders look at the Spartans' success and conclude that extreme measures are justified? Will the Spartan II precedent make future atrocities more likely because we've already crossed that line once? On the other hand, the Spartan program saved humanity from extinction. This isn't speculation or propaganda. Without the Spartan IIs, critical battles would have been lost, strategic assets destroyed. Humanity's fighting capacity degraded to the point where defeat became inevitable. Without the Spartan IIIs, vital Covenant infrastructure would have continued operating, prolonging the war and killing billions more. The body count if the Spartans hadn't existed is staggering to contemplate. Does this justify everything that was done? The philosophical framework matters here. Deontological ethics, which judges actions by whether they adhere to moral rules, would likely condemn the kidnapping and augmentation regardless of outcomes. Kidnapping is wrong, full stop, and good consequences don't change that. Consequentialist ethics, which judges actions by their results, would likely approve. The good achieved outweighed the harm done, therefore the actions were moral. Most people operate with some hybrid ethical system, and that's where the real ambiguity lives. Yes, kidnapping children is wrong, but letting billions die when you could prevent it is also wrong. When two moral imperatives conflict, when you can't avoid doing harm, how do you choose? Halsey chose to harm the few to save the many. Was she right? Consider a thought experiment. If we could go back to 2517 with full knowledge of what would happen, knowing the Covenant War was coming and knowing exactly how crucial the Spartans would be, would we create the Spartan II program? Would kidnapping 75 children be justified if we knew with certainty it would save humanity? The answer reveals our deepest ethical commitments. If you say yes, you're accepting that individual rights can be violated for collective survival. If you say no, you're accepting that moral principle matters more than survival. Neither answer is obviously correct, and people of goodwill can disagree. But the question is essential because it forces us to confront what we actually value when values conflict. The Spartan programs also raise questions about the nature of personhood and bodily autonomy. When you augment someone from childhood, when their entire conscious experience is shaped by training and conditioning, how much of their adult self was freely chosen? The Spartan IIs had their futures decided at age 6. They never had the chance to become anything other than soldiers. Even if they rationally understand and accept their role as adults, is that acceptance meaningful when they were never given alternatives? Dr. Halsey argued that she gave the Spartans purpose, made them into heroes, saved them from ordinary lives to do extraordinary things. But she made that choice for them. Some Spartans embraced their role, found meaning in their service, considered themselves fortunate to be Spartans. Others felt robbed of normal lives, angry at what was done to them, trapped in roles they never chose. Both reactions are valid, and the existence of Spartans who embrace their fate doesn't justify the choices made on behalf of those who didn't. The question of compensation and justice for the Spartans remains largely unresolved in Halo's universe. After the war, with Halsey arrested and the program's details public, what did humanity owe the surviving Spartans? They couldn't be given back their childhoods. The augmentations couldn't be reversed. Prosecuting everyone involved in the programs would require arresting hundreds of ONI personnel, military leaders, even some civilian contractors. The institutional guilt was too distributed to effectively punish. Some Spartans received token compensation, promotions, awards, public recognition, but money and medals don't give you back years stolen from you. that don't provide the normal life you never had the chance to live. For many Spartans, the only real compensation was being allowed to continue serving, to find purpose in the role they'd been forced into. That says something profound about how thoroughly the conditioning worked and how limited the options were for people transformed so completely from childhood. The ethical questions surrounding the Spartan programs don't have clear answers, and that's the point. They're meant to provoke discomfort, to make us question what we'd accept in desperate circumstances, to examine the distance between our stated moral principles and what we'd actually do if billions of lives hung in the balance. The Spartans saved humanity, but at what cost? And was it a cost worth paying? The answer depends on who you ask and what ethical framework you accept. Comparative analysis: 3 programs, 3 philosophies. When we place the 3 Spartan programs side by side, the contrasts reveal not just different methodologies, but fundamentally different philosophies about how to create supersoldiers and what trade-offs are acceptable in that creation. Each program represented a specific answer to the question, how do we make Spartans? The Spartan II program's answer was, spare no expense, accept no compromise. Halsey wanted the absolute best candidates, selected through the most rigorous genetic screening available. She wanted the most extensive augmentations possible, even if they killed half the candidates. She wanted 8 years of training from childhood, because that's what it took to produce soldiers who functioned as perfect teams. The Spartan IIs were works of art, masterpieces of military engineering that happened to be human beings. This philosophy produced 33 soldiers who were arguably the most capable combatants in human history. Out of armor, a Spartan II could flip a warthog, punch through titanium, dodge bullets through sheer reaction time. In Mjolnir armor, they became forces of nature, one-person armies that could alter the course of battles through their presence alone. The Master Chief's record speaks for itself. Countless successful missions, tactical brilliance under pressure, survival in situations that should have been fatal. But this capability came at enormous cost. The financial investment per Spartan II was astronomical. The time investment meant that replacing casualties was essentially impossible. By the time new candidates could be trained and augmented, the war would likely be over. The human cost was the most damning. 42 children dead or crippled out of 75, a casualty rate of 56% before the first combat deployment. For a military program, that's catastrophic. The Spartan IIs also suffered from psychological issues stemming from their conditioning. They had difficulty relating to normal humans. They formed intense bonds with each other, but struggled with anyone outside the program. Many showed symptoms consistent with PTSD and depression, though they rarely acknowledged it or sought help. They were supremely functional as soldiers, but somewhat dysfunctional as people, their childhood stolen, and their adult selves shaped entirely by military necessity. The Spartan III program's philosophy was maximize numbers, accept higher casualties. Ackerson looked at the war's mathematics and concluded that 33 super elite soldiers weren't enough. Humanity needed hundreds of Spartans, even if each individual Spartan was less capable than a two. The training could be compressed, the augmentations simplified, the equipment downgraded. What mattered was deployable numbers and strategic impact. This philosophy produced over 900 Spartans across 3 companies, a 30-fold increase over the twos. These Spartans were effective, accomplishing their missions with high success rates. Operations Prometheus and Torpedo destroyed strategic targets that conventional forces couldn't have touched without massive casualties. The Spartan IIIs achieved their design purpose, providing expendable supersoldiers for high-risk operations. But the cost was measured in children's lives burned through like ammunition. Alpha Company, 300 deployed, 0 survived. Beta Company, 300 deployed, 2 survived. The Spartan IIIs had lower casualty rates during training, with most candidates surviving augmentation, but their combat casualty rate was nearly 100%. The program's philosophy explicitly accepted that these soldiers would die, designed missions assuming total loss of deployed forces. The psychological cost was different from the twos, but equally severe. The threes were fueled by trauma and rage, recruited from refugee camps and given weapons to act out their pain. They were emotionally damaged before training began, and the training focused that damage into a weapon aimed at the Covenant. Some threes found meaning and purpose in this, channeling their grief into something productive. Others were essentially using military service as elaborate suicide, seeking death in combat as escape from trauma. Kurt 051's illegal augmentations for Gamma Company revealed the tension inherent in the program. He was supposed to train these children to die effectively, but he couldn't help trying to improve their survival chances. The pain resistance drugs he added saved lives in combat, but created dependency and risked psychological breaks. Kurt tried to make the Spartan III program less murderous, but its fundamental philosophy made that nearly impossible. You can't have cheap, expendable supersoldiers without accepting that expendable means they die. The Spartan IV program's philosophy was maintain ethics, accept limitations. Musa and June designed a program that could survive public scrutiny, that used adult volunteers and safe procedures. The fours would never match Spartan IIs individually, but they didn't need to. Advanced armor could compensate for less extensive augmentation. Large numbers provided strategic flexibility, and crucially, the program could continue indefinitely because recruitment wasn't limited to rare genetic profiles or traumatized war orphans. This philosophy produced hundreds of Spartans who were individually less capable than twos or threes, but far more numerous and sustainable. A Spartan IV in Gen II Mjolnir was roughly comparable to a Spartan II in older armor marks, sufficient for most combat situations. The fours suffered fewer psychological issues because they'd had normal childhoods and chose their transformation. They integrated better with non-Spartan personnel because they remembered being regular soldiers. But the limitations were real. When Spartan fours faced opponents designed to kill Spartans, like Forerunner Prometheans, they took higher casualties than twos would have. Their less extensive augmentations meant they were more dependent on armor. A Spartan 4 out of armor was far less dangerous than a Spartan 2 similarly unarmored. And the fours lacked the telepathic-seeming team coordination that twos developed through childhood training together. There's also the question of legend and morale. The Spartan twos were mythological, demons to the Covenant, legendary heroes to humanity. Their anonymity and rarity enhanced this mystique. The Spartan fours, being public figures with visible faces and known identities, couldn't maintain that mythos. They were impressive, certainly, but they were human in ways the twos transcended. Whether this was better, worse, or simply different depended on what role you thought Spartans should fill. Comparing outcomes across programs requires considering multiple metrics. In pure combat effectiveness, the Spartan 2s were superior individually, but the 4s could deploy far more widely. A 4-person 2 fire team could accomplish what might take 12 IVs, but you could deploy 3 IV fire teams for every 2 team available. Which was better strategically depended on the situation. In terms of ethical defensibility, the ranking was clear. 4s used adult volunteers. 3s used traumatized recruits. 2s used kidnapped children. But ethical superiority didn't correlate with combat effectiveness, revealing the uncomfortable truth that moral purity and practical necessity don't always align. In survival rates, the programs showed inverse relationships between training casualties and combat effectiveness. Spartan 2s had 56% training casualties, but relatively low combat casualty rates. Spartan 3s had minimal training casualties, but catastrophic combat casualty rates. Spartan 4s had essentially 0 casualties in either category, but lower individual effectiveness. The legacy of each program shaped how subsequent programs developed. The Spartan 2s proved the concept, but at such extreme cost that replication was impossible. The Spartan 2s refined the concept, but revealed that making Spartans disposable meant most would be disposed of. The Spartan 4s finally cracked the code. Sustainable production of effective soldiers without the ethical nightmares of predecessor programs. But all 3 programs shared common DNA. They transformed human beings into weapons through augmentation and training. They created soldiers who existed apart from normal society, marked by their enhancements as fundamentally different from regular people. They extracted enormous costs from their subjects, whether childhood, trauma, or permanent bodily modification. And they were all, to varying degrees, necessary for humanity's survival against threats that conventional forces couldn't handle. The question we're left with is which program represents the right balance of effectiveness and ethics? There's no obvious answer. The Spartan IIs saved humanity, but required kidnapping children. The Spartan IIIs bought time with teenagers' lives. The Spartan IVs maintained ethical standards, but couldn't have existed without the foundation their predecessors built. Each program was both necessary and terrible, effective and costly, justified and inexcusable. Perhaps the real lesson is that there is no right balance, no perfect solution when the problem is creating super soldiers. Every approach carries costs, and we can only choose which costs we're willing to pay. The Spartan programs collectively represent humanity's decision that survival justified almost any cost, almost any compromise with principle. Whether that decision was correct depends entirely on whether you think anything matters more than survival. Behind the statistics and strategic assessments lie individual human beings whose lives were irrevocably altered by these programs. To truly understand what the Spartan programs cost, we need to look at specific people and what was done to them in humanity's name. Start with John 1:17, the Master Chief. He was 6 years old when Oni agents came for him, described by Halsey's screening as having high aggression, intelligence, and leadership markers. His parents buried a flash clone, mourning a son who was still alive, stolen to become the greatest soldier in human history. John's childhood was combat training and education under Mendez. His adolescence was augmentation that killed 40 of his classmates. His young adulthood was a parade of desperate battles against impossible odds. By all accounts, John is supremely functional. He follows orders, completes missions, inspires loyalty from those who serve with him. But what would John have been if allowed a normal childhood? We'll never know. The person he could have become was erased at age 6, replaced with the Master Chief. He has no hobbies, no interests outside military applications, no relationships that aren't based on shared combat experience. His best friend is an artificial intelligence. This is what the Spartan II program did. It created a perfect soldier by eliminating everything else. Consider Samuel 034, the first Spartan killed in action. Sam was John's close friend from their earliest training days, part of the core group that bonded during those brutal childhood exercises. In 2525, during a boarding action against a Covenant vessel, Sam's armor was breached. Spartans can't survive vacuum exposure, even with augmented physiology. Sam stayed behind to manually detonate a nuclear device, destroying the ship while his teammates escaped. He was 14 years old. Sam died accomplishing his mission, protecting his team, doing exactly what he was trained to do. But he died as a child soldier who'd been taken from his family and trained for 8 years specifically to fight in a war he hadn't chosen. His sacrifice was heroic, but should he have been in that position in the first place? His parents mourned him twice, once when they buried a flash clone, once when they learned years later that their real son had died in space. Kurt-051's story encompasses both victim and perpetrator. He was kidnapped like the others, augmented, trained, became an exceptional Spartan II. Then Oni staged his death and assigned him to train Spartan IIIs. For over 20 years, Kurt trained children to die. He lived with Alpha Company, taught them everything he knew, and watched 300 of them die on Prometheus. He did it again with Beta Company. 300 more children trained and deployed, 2 survivors. By Gamma Company, he was actively sabotaging the programs designed to improve survival chances. Kurt's final act was redemption, or atonement, depending on your perspective. At Onyx, with Covenant forces threatening to overwhelm the survivors he was protecting, Kurt stayed behind. Mortally wounded, he detonated 2 nuclear warheads, vaporizing himself and the pursuing enemy. His last transmission: Spartans never die. He bought survival for the Spartans in the Shield world, but he did it by becoming what the Spartan III program always intended: an expendable soldier who traded his life for mission success. The psychological burden Kurt carried during those years is almost unimaginable. He cared about his Spartans, viewed them as the children he'd never have, tried desperately to prepare them for survival. But the program's design ensured most would die regardless of preparation. He trained them knowing they were doomed, unable to stop it, complicit in their deaths even as he tried to prevent them. That kind of psychological trauma doesn't heal. It accumulates until the weight becomes unbearable. Lucy B091 and Tom B292, the only survivors of Operation Torpedo, carried different scars. Tom maintained his ability to function, though he was haunted by memories of watching 300 teammates die around him. He became a trainer for Gamma Company, channeling his pain into helping the next generation. But Lucy stopped speaking entirely. The trauma of Torpedo broke something in her, severing her ability or willingness to communicate verbally. She continued serving, fighting, training others, but she did it in silence, her voice stolen by what she witnessed. Lucy's mutism is particularly tragic because it's not physical. She can speak. She chooses not to. Or perhaps more accurately, some part of her psyche refuses to let her. It's a visible manifestation of psychological damage that many Spartans carried invisibly. The Spartan III program broke her in ways that augmentation procedures never could. And unlike physical injuries, this wound had no clear treatment or healing timeline. Noble Team's individual fates during the fall of Reach illustrate the Spartan III experience in microcosm. Jorge 052, the team's only Spartan II, sacrificed himself believing he'd saved Reach with a slip space bomb, not knowing the invasion was just beginning. His death was operationally useless, a sacrifice that accomplished nothing strategically. Catherine B320, Cat, was killed by a Covenant sniper, a random shot that killed one of the smartest Spartans in the program. Carter A259 deliberately crashed his Pelican to clear a path, trading his life for tactical advantage. Emil A239 died in close combat, surrounded by enemies, going down fighting like the warrior he'd been trained to be. Many part of Noble Six's last stand on Reach is perhaps the most haunting. After ensuring the Pillar of Autumn escaped with Cortana and vital data, Six remained behind, with no extraction possible, no hope of survival. The last scene shows Six alone, surrounded by Covenant forces, helmet cracked, fighting until overwhelmed. Six dies, defending a position that no longer matters strategically, buying time that benefits no one, making a stand simply because that's what Spartans do. What makes Six's death particularly poignant is its inevitability. From the moment Six volunteered to stay behind, the outcome was certain. This wasn't heroic sacrifice in the heat of battle. It was choosing to die slowly, alone, killing enemies until they eventually killed you. It's the Spartan III program distilled to its essence. Soldiers trained to accept death as the expected outcome, who fight until they drop because they literally don't know how to do anything else. The Spartan IVs have different stories, because they came to the program as adults with established identities. Sarah Palmer was a skilled ODST who became Spartan Operations' first commander. She brought an aggressive leadership style and a chip on her shoulder about proving fours were as capable as earlier generations. Her journey involved learning to respect the sacrifices twos and threes made, while maintaining that fours were legitimate Spartans in their own right. Edward Buck's story is particularly interesting because we see his decision-making process. He was an experienced ODST, a leader, someone with a solid career and relationships. He chose to become a Spartan IV, but that choice came with costs. His relationship with Veronica Dare became complicated. She was Oni. He was becoming a Spartan. Their lives were diverging. He gained enhanced abilities and status, but lost the camaraderie of his old ODST squad, the comfort of being just another soldier rather than a legendary Spartan. The Fours didn't have childhood stolen, but they sacrificed their former identities. Once you become a Spartan, you're never just yourself again. You're a symbol, a legend, a weapon. Regular soldiers relate to you differently. Civilians treat you like a celebrity or a freak. You can never return to normal life because your body is permanently altered and your place in society fundamentally changed. The Fours chose this, but choice doesn't eliminate cost. Musa 096's story is perhaps the most tragically ironic. He was one of the 12 Spartan II washouts, crippled by augmentation procedures, spending decades in a wheelchair, while his successful classmates became legends. He carried enormous resentment toward Halsey for what she'd done to him, for the childhood stolen and the body broken. Yet he created the Spartan IV program, ensuring that more people would be transformed into Spartans, perpetuating the cycle that had victimized him. Musa's contradiction reveals something essential about the Spartans. Even those who suffered most from the programs often believed in their necessity. He hated what Halsey did to him personally, but understood that Spartans were needed. His Spartan IV program tried to correct the ethical failures of earlier generations while preserving their effectiveness. Whether he succeeded or simply created a more palatable form of the same problem remains debatable. The washouts themselves represent a category of victims often forgotten. 30 Spartan IIs died during augmentation. 12 survived but were crippled. These weren't failures to be discarded. They were children who suffered catastrophically from procedures they hadn't consented to. Some were placed in cryogenic storage. Others were rehabilitated and pressed into Oni service, their survival kept secret. Halsey visited them periodically, documenting their conditions, perhaps seeking redemption, or perhaps just satisfying scientific curiosity. The question of what these individuals were owed haunts discussions of Spartan ethics. They received no compensation adequate to their suffering. They couldn't pursue normal lives with their bodies broken. Many remained in military service simply because they had nowhere else to go and no other skills. They were collateral damage in humanity's survival, acknowledged, but not truly addressed. There are also the families to consider. Parents who buried flash clones, mourning children who were still alive somewhere, transformed into soldiers they would never meet. Siblings who grew up with holes in their families, wondering what their brother or sister would have been like. These ripple effects extended across decades and hundreds of people, secondary victims of a program that directly victimized 75 children. Some parents eventually learned the truth about the Spartan II program. Imagine receiving that information. Your child didn't die. They were kidnapped, experimented on, turned into a super soldier, and deployed in the most dangerous combat operations humanity ever faced. Some were relieved their children lived. Others were horrified by what had been done to them. Many felt both simultaneously, unable to reconcile gratitude that their child survived with rage at what survival cost them. The broader human cost includes the societies that the Spartans protected but could never truly join. Spartans saved billions of lives, but those billions lived normal existences that Spartans could only observe from outside. The gap between Spartans and normal humanity wasn't just physical. It was psychological, social, existential. Spartans were humanity's defenders, but not truly part of humanity anymore. They existed in a liminal space, too enhanced to be normal, too human to be merely weapons, belonging nowhere entirely. This isolation was particularly acute for Spartan IIs, who had no memories of normal life to anchor them. They related to each other with an intensity that approached telepathy, understanding each other perfectly because they'd shared the same formative experiences. But they struggled to connect with anyone outside the program. Romantic relationships were nearly impossible. How do you date someone when you've been trained since age 6 to be a weapon? Friendships with non-Spartans were strained by the gulf in experience and capability. The Spartan IIIs, recruited from trauma, carried different isolation. They related to each other through shared pain, through rage at the Covenant, through the understanding that they were all damaged and deployed anyway. Many formed intense bonds within their companies, but those bonds were often severed by death. The survivors, the few who made it through operations that killed their entire companies, carried guilt that compounded their isolation. Why did I survive when everyone else died? That question haunted them with no satisfying answer. Even the Spartan IVs, who had the most normal backgrounds, found themselves isolated by transformation. Your old squad mates can't relate to you anymore because you're fundamentally different now. Civilians treat you like a celebrity or weapon, not a person. Your body requires specialized maintenance that makes you dependent on UNSC infrastructure. You've permanently altered yourself. And while you chose it, the consequences are more profound than you anticipated when you volunteered. The individual stories behind the Spartan programs reveal what statistics obscure. These were real people with hopes, fears, potential, all of which was channeled into a single purpose. Some found meaning in that purpose, became fulfilled by service, considered themselves fortunate despite everything. Others were broken by it, traumatized by what they experienced and what they were forced to do. Most fell somewhere in between, carrying both pride in their accomplishments and pain from their sacrifices. The tragedy isn't just what happened to these individuals, but what they never had the chance to become. John 117 might have been a great athlete, or teacher, or engineer. Kurt 051 might have been an artist, or diplomat, or scientist. Lucy B091 might have been anything other than a traumatized child soldier who lost her voice. We'll never know, because those possibilities were eliminated when they became Spartans. And yet, without them, humanity would have been exterminated. That's the unbearable weight at the center of the Spartan programs. These individuals suffered terribly, were victimized by systems that used them as tools, lost childhoods and futures, and sometimes lives. But their suffering saved billions. Their sacrifice, however involuntary, meant that human civilization survived. Can we mourn what was done to them while being grateful that it was done? Can we hold both truths simultaneously? That the Spartan programs were atrocities and necessities. There's no easy answer. Only the uncomfortable reality that sometimes survival requires costs we'd rather not pay. Legacy in blood and steel. What the Spartans mean for humanity's future. By 2560, 7 years after the Human Covenant War ended, the Spartan programs had fundamentally reshaped human civilization. The immediate military impact was obvious. Spartans had prevented extinction and continued serving as humanity's first response to major threats. But the deeper implications, the ways that Spartans changed how humanity viewed itself and its place in the galaxy, were more subtle and potentially more significant. The most immediate legacy was institutional. Spartan operations existed as a permanent branch of the UNSC military, with dedicated facilities, training programs, equipment manufacture, and career paths. Being a Spartan was no longer an emergency measure or secret program. It was an established military specialty with clear recruitment, advancement, and support structures. The normalization of Spartans represented a permanent change in how humanity waged war. This normalization had philosophical implications. Humanity had accepted that some conflicts required transhuman soldiers, that normal humans weren't adequate for all combat situations. The line between human and post-human, once clear, had been deliberately blurred in service of military necessity. We created soldiers who exceeded human limitations, then integrated them into our society as a permanent feature rather than a temporary aberration. What does that say about what we think humans are or should be? The existence of Spartans created a new social category, enhanced humans living among normal humans in a hierarchical military structure. This raised questions about equality and rights. Should Spartans receive special privileges because of their enhancements? Should they face special restrictions because of their capabilities? How do you maintain democratic values when some citizens are literally superhuman soldiers? The UNSC's answer was complicated and contradictory. Spartans received elite status, advanced equipment, high-priority missions. They were simultaneously celebrated as heroes and monitored as potential threats. Their enhanced capabilities were treated as military assets to be deployed, not personal attributes they controlled. Spartans served at the pleasure of the UNSC command structure, their lives directed by strategic necessity rather than personal choice. Even the volunteer Spartan force. This created tension between Spartans and civilian oversight. In democratic societies, military forces are supposed to be subordinate to civilian authority, but Spartans were so effective that civilian leaders often deferred to their judgment on military matters. The Master Chief, for example, had repeatedly made strategic decisions that altered humanity's trajectory, operating with minimal oversight because he'd proven himself trustworthy. Whether this was appropriate or a dangerous precedent depended on your views about military authority. The Spartans also represented humanity's willingness to embrace technology that modified the human form. Augmentation wasn't new. People had been getting prosthetics, genetic therapies, and enhancements for centuries. But Spartans took this to an extreme, transforming humans into beings that could barely be called human anymore. They set a precedent that human biology was negotiable, that modification in pursuit of capability was acceptable. This precedent had implications for civilian society. If military personnel could be augmented to exceed human limitations, why couldn't civilians? Should enhanced humans exist only in military contexts? Or should enhancements be available to anyone who wanted them? The medical technology used to create Spartans had potential applications in treating injuries, enhancing athletic performance, extending human capability in dozens of domains. Should those applications be pursued or restricted? These questions became particularly urgent as some Spartans retired or left military service. What happens when super soldiers return to civilian life? They're still enhanced, still capable of feats no normal human can match. Are they dangerous? Should they face restrictions on where they can live or what jobs they can hold? Or are they just citizens who happen to have unusual capabilities, deserving the same rights as anyone else? The augmentation precedent also raised questions about equality and access. Becoming a Spartan required military service, which meant the poor and colonials had more opportunities for enhancement than wealthy Earth citizens who could avoid military careers. This inverted the usual dynamic, where the wealthy had better access to life-improving technology. Some argued this was justice, compensation for the risks military service entailed. Others worried it created a warrior caste, a group defined by enhanced capabilities and military loyalty. The psychological legacy of the Spartan programs was equally complex. Humanity had decided that creating child soldiers was acceptable if the threat was large enough. This decision, once made, couldn't be unmade. The precedent existed now, codified in history. Faced with extinction, humanity would do anything, including sacrificing children. What does that mean for future ethical decision-making when threats emerge? Some argued the Spartans proved that extreme measures work, that being willing to cross ethical lines is necessary for survival. The consequentialist view held that Halsey and Ackerson made difficult but correct decisions, and their vindication by success meant similar decisions should be made in future crises. This was dangerous territory, suggesting that any means could be justified by sufficient threat. Others argued the opposite. The Spartans proved that such measures should never be needed, because humanity should prevent crises from reaching that point. The focus should be on diplomacy, intelligence, early intervention, anything that avoids situations where sacrificing children becomes necessary. This view saw the Spartans as a failure of policy, not a success of tactics, a reminder that humanity had nearly been destroyed because it failed to maintain adequate defenses and diplomatic relations. The Spartan IV program's existence as the ethical Spartan program had its own implications. By creating Spartans from adult volunteers, humanity signaled that it had learned from earlier mistakes, that the ends didn't automatically justify the means, that ethical concerns mattered even in military contexts. This was progress, but it was also reputation management. The IVs existed partly to reassure people that humanity wasn't still kidnapping children to create supersoldiers. The cultural impact of Spartans was enormous. They appeared in propaganda, media, popular culture. Children grew up with Spartan action figures and stories. The Master Chief was possibly the most famous human alive, his image recognizable across human space. Noble Team became icons of sacrifice and determination. Spartans embodied humanity's survival and excellence. The idea that humans could face any threat and prevail through courage and capability. But this cultural lionization obscured the cost. The stories celebrating Spartans rarely mentioned the kidnapped children, the war orphans trained for suicide missions, the families destroyed to create weapons. The legend was sanitized, made palatable for mass consumption. This wasn't necessarily malicious. Societies need heroes and myths. But it meant most people didn't understand what Spartans actually were, or how they'd been created. This gap between legend and reality created problems when the truth emerged. The revelation that Spartan IIs were kidnapped children shocked civilian populations. Some people felt betrayed, lied to, about the heroes they'd celebrated. Others rationalized it, arguing that the ends justified the means. The debate divided societies, with some calling for accountability and others defending the programs as necessary. The cultural conversation about Spartans became a proxy for broader questions about military ethics, government oversight, and what democracies should tolerate from their militaries in wartime. The technological legacy was perhaps most concrete. The Spartan programs drove advances in augmentation procedures, powered armor, medical technology, and materials science. The research conducted to create Spartans had applications throughout civilian medicine and engineering. Techniques developed to augment soldiers were adapted to treat injuries and disabilities. Mjolnir armor technology influenced powered exoskeletons for industrial use. The Spartans were a military program, but they produced technological benefits that extended far beyond combat. This created a dilemma for critics of the programs. Even if you believed the ethical costs were too high, the technological benefits were real and significant. Condemning the Spartan programs meant dismissing the advances they produced. This made criticism complicated and gave defenders ammunition. How can you say the programs shouldn't have existed when you benefit from the technology they developed? The question of what humanity owed the Spartans remained contentious. Some argued for monetary compensation, though no amount of money could truly compensate for a stolen childhood. Others suggested honors, recognition, monuments to their service. Some Spartans wanted nothing except to be left alone, to serve or retire without being treated as curiosities. The diversity of Spartan perspectives made a unified solution impossible. The Master Chief's post-war status exemplified this tension. He was the most famous Spartan, arguably the most famous human alive. But he was also an incredibly private person who'd spent his entire life in military service. Fame made him uncomfortable. Civilian interactions confused him. He wanted to serve, not be celebrated. Yet he couldn't avoid the legend that surrounded him, couldn't stop being a symbol, even when he just wanted to be a soldier. Looking forward, the Spartan program's legacy would shape how humanity approached future conflicts and challenges. The precedent existed now. Humans could be enhanced, transformed into post-human soldiers if threats required it. This precedent would be invoked in future debates about military policy, ethics, and the limits of acceptable action in warfare. The Spartans were simultaneously example and warning, proof that extreme measures could work and that they came with costs that reverberated for generations. The philosophical question underlying everything was whether humanity had fundamentally changed by creating Spartans. Were we still the same species that had reached for the stars, or had we become something different by deliberately modifying ourselves into warriors? The transhumanist perspective held that this was evolution, necessary adaptation to a hostile galaxy. The humanist perspective worried that we'd lost something essential, that the willingness to transform children into weapons represented a corruption of human values. Both perspectives had merit. Humanity survived because of the Spartans. That was undeniable. But survival came at the cost of doing things that previous generations would have considered unthinkable. The society that emerged from the Covenant War was harder, more willing to accept extreme measures, less constrained by ethical concerns when survival was at stake. Whether this was wisdom or trauma, strength or damage remained an open question. The Spartans themselves were living reminders of these questions. Every time a Spartan II appeared in public, people saw a kidnapped child transformed into a weapon. Every Spartan III represented a war orphan whose trauma was weaponized. Every Spartan IV embodied the choice to permanently modify yourself into something more and less than human. They were walking ethical dilemmas, heroes and victims, saviors and cautionary tales. As humanity moved forward into the 2560s, dealing with new threats like the created uprising and rogue AI, Spartans remained essential to military operations, but their existence raised questions that had no easy answers. How much should humanity rely on these post-human warriors? What happens if we face a threat that even Spartans can't handle? Have we become dependent on extreme solutions, unable to address problems through conventional means? And what does that dependence say about what humanity has become? The legacy of the Spartan programs was written in blood and steel, in saved lives and stolen childhoods, in victories bought with sacrifices that could never be repaid. It was a legacy of both triumph and tragedy, of survival purchased at costs we'd rather not have paid, but couldn't avoid. The Spartans saved humanity, but in doing so, they changed what humanity was. Whether that change was progress or regression, evolution or corruption, was a question each person had to answer for themselves. Conclusion: the mirror of necessity. We've journeyed through 3 generations of Spartans, examined the training that forged them, the ethics that should have restrained them, and the outcomes they produced. We've seen children kidnapped and turned into weapons, war orphans trained for suicide missions, adult volunteers transformed into post-human soldiers. We've explored the philosophical questions these programs raise about ends and means, about what we're willing to sacrifice for survival, about the distance between the values we profess and the actions we take when existence itself is threatened. The Spartan programs don't provide easy answers because they weren't meant to. They're moral thought experiments made flesh, asking us what we'd do if billions of lives hung in the balance and the only solution required sacrificing children. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes there are no good choices, only choices between different kinds of harm, and that surviving doesn't necessarily mean we made the right decisions, only that we lived to question them. Dr. Halsey kidnapped 75 children and subjected them to procedures that killed or crippled 42 of them. This was evil by any conventional moral framework, but those 33 survivors prevented humanity's extinction multiple times over. Can both things be true simultaneously? Can Halsey be both war criminal and savior? The answer is yes. And that's what makes the Spartan story so compelling and disturbing. We want our heroes to be purely heroic and our villains to be purely villainous. The Spartans don't allow that comfort. Colonel Ackerson created a program that deliberately designed suicide missions for teenagers, expending hundreds of young lives to achieve strategic objectives. This was monstrous, a cynical calculation that treated children as ammunition. But those suicide missions destroyed targets that conventional forces couldn't touch, bought time that allowed humanity to survive long enough to win the war. Again, both things are true. The Spartan III program was both atrocity and necessity. The Spartan IV program tried to solve the ethical problems by using adult volunteers and safe procedures. It succeeded in creating a sustainable, ethical Spartan program, but it only existed because the unethical programs came first, proved the concept, justified the investment. The Fourthies benefited from research conducted on kidnapped children. Can you build an ethical program on an unethical foundation? The question lingers uncomfortably. The Spartans themselves carry these contradictions in their own bodies and minds. They're victims who became heroes, children who became legends, weapons who retained their humanity against all odds. They suffered terribly and accomplished the impossible. They were robbed of normal lives and given extraordinary purpose. They saved billions while losing themselves. All of these things are simultaneously true. None fully capture what the Spartans are. What the Spartan programs ultimately reveal is the gap between our ideals and our actions when survival is at stake. We'd like to believe we'd maintain our principles regardless of circumstances, that there are lines we'd never cross no matter the threat. The Spartans demonstrate that those lines are more negotiable than we want to admit, that faced with extinction, we'd do things we'd normally consider unthinkable, and that we'd rationalize those actions afterward as necessary, even if we couldn't quite call them right. This doesn't mean ethics are meaningless or that anything is justifiable if the threat is large enough. It means that real ethical decision-making is messy, complicated, full of trade-offs between competing goods and varying harms. The Spartan programs weren't right or wrong in some absolute sense. They were desperate measures taken by desperate people facing an existential threat, measures that worked but came with costs that could never be fully paid or justified. The legacy of the Spartans will continue shaping humanity for generations. The precedents set, the technology developed, the philosophical questions raised, all persist long after the immediate crisis that created them. Humanity learned that it could create post-human warriors, that extreme measures could work, that survival sometimes required sacrificing principle. These lessons are dangerous because they make future atrocities easier to justify. they're also valuable because they're honest about what survival sometimes costs. Perhaps the most important lesson is that we should never stop questioning these decisions. Never become comfortable with the idea that ends automatically justify means. The fact that the Spartan program saved humanity doesn't mean they were unambiguously good. The fact that they required terrible sacrifices doesn't mean they were unnecessary. We have to hold both truths, acknowledge both the costs and the benefits, and remain vigilant against using past successes to justify future atrocities. The Spartans saved humanity, but they also serve as a mirror reflecting what we're capable of when sufficiently threatened. That reflection isn't entirely flattering. It shows a species willing to sacrifice its children, to create weapons out of traumatized orphans, to permanently modify humans into post-human soldiers. It also shows a species that survives, that adapts, that refuses to surrender even when defeat seems inevitable. Both images are true. Both are who we are. If you've made it this far through this exploration of the Spartan programs, thank you for engaging with these difficult questions. The Halo universe uses science fiction to examine real ethical dilemmas, asking what we do in impossible situations. The Spartans aren't just super soldiers in powered armor. They're thought experiments about human nature, about what we value and what we are willing to sacrifice. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of science fiction's most morally complex military programs, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps immensely and lets me know you want more content that doesn't shy away from the uncomfortable questions these stories ask. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts on the Spartan programs. Were they justified? Was there a better alternative? Which program represents the best balance of ethics and effectiveness? I'd love to hear your perspective. Until next time, sleep well. And remember, in the darkest corners of our fictional universes, we often find the most honest reflections of ourselves. The Spartans show us what humanity becomes when survival requires sacrificing humanity itself. Whether that's a tragedy, or triumph, or simply reality, is something each of us has to decide. Good night.